Okay, so this time we're going to look at what happens when it's two kings on the board, but more than one pawn, or I should say pawns for both sides. King and two pawns against a king, we're not wasting time looking at, because if you've mastered the previous PowerPoint of how to win with a king and one pawn, then king and two pawns really is a doddle. So not wasting time with that. But a king and two pawns against a king and a pawn can be tricky. And well, we need to know some of the general principles as to how, as to how to get through it and how to maximize your chances of winning if you have the extra pawn, or how to perhaps get away with a draw if you're the one that's losing, if you're behind, if you can. So what's going on? So winning and endings with kings and pawns, we usually come down to three things. So accurate counting. So you need to know how many moves your pawns need to promote. The opposition that we discussed in the previous PowerPoint is important, and the relative positions of the kings. So which ones are closest to the action, basically. And this funny suggestion that in chess a straight line isn't always the quickest route from A to B. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, sometimes you're better off taking a slightly circuitous, is a good word, circuitous, a circuitous route. But generally it will be the straight line, but not always. There's exceptions. So what on earth have we got going on here? Well, it looks as though white is doomed, doesn't it? Because king takes queen, and then black plays a5, and it looks as though the pawn will win the race. So you just set that up on your board. King takes queen, black plays a5, and now how on earth can the white king stop the black pawn from promoting? Well, let's see. What's going on here? How can we do it? Well, think about rule 3. Have a pause on that. See if you can come up with what's the correct move. So remember this, we've played king to a8 as white. Black has played a5, so has moved his pawn forward 2 squares. If the white pawn moves forward to f7, then king to g7 just wins that pawn. There's nothing that white can do. So is the game lost? Right, okay, so white can save this, and there's two ways. Now, ideally, there's two possible things. White either wants to get to the black pawn before it can queen, but a simple straight foot race will, it's obvious the black pawn gets there first. Or the white king needs to be able to get to e7 to help his own pawn promote. So the shortest distance between 2 points is not always a straight line. Okay, so king to b7 is the correct move. a4. Black, not unreasonably, the best bet for black is just to move the pawn forward and try to promote. But now king to c6. Black pushes on to a3. King to d6. a2. White plays to f7. The black king doesn't want the white pawn to promote, and so goes to g7. And white will play king to e7. And then both sides get a queen, and we should be looking at a draw. Or, so do put that on a board, press pause, put it on a board and give it a go. Or, king to b7, king to g6, so black immediately decides to go for the pawn. King to c6. Now, if black now takes the white pawn, what will happen is white will play king b5 and we'll just get the black pawn. It's a draw. So black plays a4, and now white goes king to d5, even further from the black pawn, because now if black plays a3, instead of chasing after that black pawn, white will go king to e6, black will play a2, white will play f7, and then a1 is a queen, f8 is a queen, and we're back to king and queen against king and queen, another draw. One last one. King to b7, a4, king to c6, king g6, king d5, and king takes pawn, king to c4, a3, king to b3, a2, king takes a2. I'll leave that on the screen for a second so you can press pause and get your board handy and check that through. So the shortest distance between 2 points in chess is not always a straight line. And positions that look lost sometimes can be saved with a bit of clever lateral thinking. Okay, so if you followed everything in that exercise, you are well on the way to understanding how to win or draw if you're losing. So how to save it with a draw, these endings of kings and pawns. So, okay, here's some general principles. So patterns to remember. The first one, this will come up sometimes, is the black king is completely trapped here. If the black king plays king takes c5, takes the white pawn on c5, he then can't stop the other pawn from promoting, he's too far behind. So the king here is paralyzed. And what this means is that while the black king is staying around those two white pawns to keep an eye on them, a white king the other side of the board can be creating havoc. And this is an exact example. So what's going on here? So we know that the black king can't do a lot. And what happens? White can't play king to h5 because e5, king takes pawn, e4, king g5, e3, and the black pawn is just too far ahead. So have a pause here, set this up, and try to think about how white can improve on his play. So king to h5 is played, e5 is played, but king to h6 isn't any good. It loses because this pawn is too far ahead. So after king h5 and e5, what can white play instead that's better and will win the game? If you want to work that out, press pause. And for those of us who are just looking at the board, here's the answer. So it's in counting the number of squares needed. So king h5 is correct. e5 is pretty much the only good black move. You can work out for yourself why king b5 is a bit rubbish later. But now white's next move is really, really surprising. So after black plays e5, what does white do? Instead of taking on h6, what do we do? What do we do here as white? Well, the correct move is king to g4. And there's now no way to save the black pawns. So if black, so the white king is now here. If black plays e4, we can go king f4. And this one is too far behind. White can mop up this one and still get back in time to stop the other pawn. Kind of cool. I've lost my arrow. There it is. Obviously, if black plays the pawn forward with check, then we've got time to go king here, pawn forward, king takes, pawn forward, king f4, pawn forward, king b3. So there's actually, you've just wasted a move as white and you've saved the game. In fact, you'll win the game because you can mop up both of these pawns. It's really, really quite interesting stuff. My arrow has disappeared again. Oop, there we go. Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. So king to g4. And if pawn forward, king f4 just wins. If black tries h5, then we can do some mopping up anyway. King here, h4, king back here, wins. If black at any point plays king to b5, so what we'll do, we'll say king g4, king b5, king f5, and again, there's just no way to save the black pawns. So really, really, really interesting endgame analysis. But that's quite complicated stuff. Let's move on to some slightly simpler themes. So, vital theme in these sort of endings, and always in chess, is the idea of creating a passed pawn. So that's a pawn who has no enemy in front of him or on the next door file. So in this situation, even though black is a pawn ahead, white is winning because the pawn on b4 cannot be stopped. There's no way for black to get there in time to stop the white pawn. This position is really, really important that you know how to create a passed pawn. And you're not going to want to do this as white because the trick won't work because the black pawns are the closest ones to the queening square. But there is a way to create a passed pawn in this situation, 3v3. It's quite well known. So have a think about that. If you want to hit pause and have a think about it, that's fine. And we'll look at the answer on the next slide. Okay, so if you didn't press pause, or if you did and you were looking for the answer, here's the winning move. The correct move is G3. So white has to take, because if white doesn't take, then that black pawn will take on F2 or H2 and just promote. So white has to take the black pawn on G3. And then a black pawn must take one for the team. That's the clue of the next move. Distract a white pawn. Okay, so here's the solution. We move the pawn forward. If white plays F takes G3, the winning move for black is going to be playing F3. Why? Sorry, I've just got the muddle up. So if white plays F takes, I thought that looked wrong. White plays F takes G3, then the winning move is H3. Why? Well, because if the white pawn from here takes on F4, then H takes G2 promotes. Wow. If the G pawn takes on H3, then this pawn, instead of capturing, simply slides past, and there's now nothing here to stop it. Okay. Similarly, if white plays H takes G3, then it's F3 that's the sacrifice for the same reason. So if pawn takes here, the H pawn can slide past unprevented. And if white doesn't play pawn takes F3, then black will play from here to here next move and promote that way. So set that one up on the board and have a go. But this is a pattern that is well worth remembering. How do you create a passed pawn from 3 versus 3? Right, let's have another example. So when there's pawns on both sides, it's possible that one of the kings might have to go and deal with them, which leaves the other king free to tidy up without the enemy king being a pest. So passed pawns, or situations like we just saw where one can be made, are very, very good at this kind of distraction. So let's have a look at an example. And on the face of it, at a glance, it's 2 pawns versus 2 pawns. But what actually will happen here is that black will lose. Why? Well, basically because the white passed pawn is going to distract the black king. And there's loads of ways for white to win this. Doesn't really matter whose move it is. The point is that whilst this black king is distracted, stopping this white pawn from getting to A8, the white king comes over here, takes these 2 pawns off and marches that up to the end of the board. I won't go into variations on this. If you want to try it on your own board or get an opponent to play black, please do. But the use of this pawn as a distraction of the black king, so the black king's going to be busy stopping this pawn promoting, allows the white king to come over here and mop up these 2. And then there's nothing to stop white pushing the H pawn forward and winning the game. Like so. And that's called the distant passed pawn. Okay, so it's really over to you. A good idea might be to revisit pawn wars, but perhaps you could try rolling a dice to see how many pawns each player starts with. So you might end up with 5v3 or 6v4 or even 6v6. And then let the players set however many pawns they've been given up on wherever they like, as long as they're regular starting squares, and see if you can win or save the resulting endgame positions. Awesome. Good luck.